After arriving here at my patron's mansion in Silverlight, something has really stood out to me. Cognitive shadows are weird. This entire city of Silverlight is in the cognitive realm, and as such, it's a hub for interplanetary scholarship. So you see all kinds of people around here, even dead ones. My research has led me to see that there are many different kinds of cognitive shadows, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. As such, I'm going to have to talk about specific characters and types of characters in the Cosmere, so there will be a couple of spoilers in this video.
In this video, there will be spoilers from Warbreaker, Hero of Ages, Secret History, the Stormlight Archive, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, and more. I'll try to avoid story spoilers where I can, but this might be a good video to skip if you haven't read a good chunk of the Cosmere. Cognitive shadows are essentially the ghosts of the Cosmere. They've been described as a fossilized copy of a person's soul made of investiture. This copying process can be done in a number of ways, and the amount of the original soul being copied can vary depending on the process. My soul, Zael said, is like that fossil. Every part of my soul has been replaced with something new, though it happened in a flash for me. The soul I have now resembles the one I was born with, but it's something else entirely. I don't understand. Imagine it this way. You know how you can make an imprint in creme and let it dry, and fill that imprint with wax to create a copy of your original object? Well, that happened to my soul. When I died, it was drenched in power. So when my soul escaped, it left a duplicate. A kind of fossil of a soul. Happened to your friend too. Up in the prison, the Heralds too, Zael said. When they died, they left an imprint behind. Power that remembered being them. You see, the power wants to be alive. He gestured with his chin towards Syl, flying down beneath them as a ribbon of light. She's what I now call a Type 1 invested entity. I decided that had to be the proper way to refer to them. Power that came alive on its own. Cut off a bit of divinity and leave it alone, eventually it comes alive. And if you let a man die with too invested a soul, or invest him right as he's dying, he'll leave behind a shadow you can nail back onto a body. His own, if you're feeling charitable. Once done, you have this. Zael waved to himself. Type 2 invested entity. Dead man walking.
In broad terms, this fossilized spirit is prevented from moving on to the beyond because it's anchored to something highly invested. Usually this anchors in the cognitive realm, but occasionally there are examples of it being anchored to something in the physical realm.
This anchor can be a chunk of investiture or a shard itself that forms a strong connection to a cognitive shadow. Basically, it changes what the cognitive shadow is being pulled towards. Instead of being pulled towards the beyond, they're pulled towards their anchor. It's kind of like magnets and a metal object against gravity. Gravity is always pulling on the metal object, but the magnet prevents it from falling. In this case, gravity is the beyond, and the magnet is the anchor of the cognitive shadow. How death seems to work in the Cosmere is when a physical body dies, that person appears in the next layer of reality above them. In the case of the physical realm, it's the cognitive. They briefly pass through and then continue to the spiritual above that.
The amount of time that someone spends in the cognitive realm before being pulled towards the beyond is directly related to how invested they were when they died.
What is this? Eshonai thought. You were highly invested when you died, a voice said. It rumbled with the sound of 1,000 storms echoing through her. So you persist for a short time. Invested? Eshonai thought. You were radiant when you died. You couldn't have said the words under the water, but I accepted them anyway. How do you think you survived that long without breathing? She floated. So this is my soul? Some would call it that, said the Rider of Storms. Some would say it is a spren formed from the power you left, imprinted with your memories. Either way, this is the end. You will pass into eternity soon, and even I cannot see what is beyond.
I've often used the metaphor of how fossils get made, right? When a fossil is made, there is a pattern, and it is slowly replaced with another substance that is stronger and more endurant, but also and has the shape of it. But is it still the bone? When you have a fossil bone, is it the dinosaur bone? In most cases, no, but yes, it's the ship of Theseus. Sort of thing again, right? Is this the bone, is it not? Is this the soul, is this the person, is it not? That's the same sort of thing that's happening with cognitive shadow.
Generally, a cognitive shadow is stuck in the cognitive realm unless something can pull them into the physical realm. Before diving into the different types of cognitive shadows, I think it's important that we talk about the characteristics that they all have. I think it's helpful to think of it like a taxonomic hierarchy.
For example, all canines are in the order Carnivora, but not all canines are foxes. They all have traits of their order, but can also have traits that are unique to the specific kind of cognitive shadow that they are. So in the order of cognitive shadows, these are the traits that all of these entities have in common. 1. They used to be alive, or started their existence in the physical realm. 2. They're prevented from continuing to the beyond by some invested anchor, typically in the cognitive realm. 3. They have some level of investiture on their own. 4. They are a Type 2 invested entity. We'll discuss more of what that means below. 5. At least a portion of their cognitive aspect and spirit web has been replaced by investiture. That's the fossilization I mentioned earlier.
These are the rules I'm comfortable assigning to all cognitive shadows. But there are another set of rules that applies to most cognitive shadows that have asterisks attached to them. Things that we're told cognitive shadows can't do unless they are? Before moving on to the traits that almost all cognitive shadows have, I think it'll be helpful to list the types of cognitive shadows that we know to exist, so we can see the patterns and then observe the ones that break these patterns.
From Roshar, we have the Heralds, the Fused, the Stormfather, and Zeth. From Scadrial, we have Kelsier. From Threnody, we have the Shades. From Nalthis, we have the Returned. And from Komashi, we have Nightmares and the Yoki-Hijo.
I'll do a quick rundown of what these cognitive shadows and their anchors are later in the video, but for now, let's move on to the rules with asterisks.
1. Cognitive shadows stapled into a physical body are unable to have children. This trait of cognitive shadows comes from Warbreaker, where we're told that Returned cannot have children. But this is even contradicted by events in the history of Nalthis itself, the royal locks being caused by having a Returned in your bloodline, and the Warbreaker annotations by Brandon. It is possible for a Returned to have a child. Vo, the first Returned, did it. The God King isn't special in that he can do it, any of the Returned could. But it requires some special knowledge that, I'm afraid, I'll have to keep secret until the sequel. Suffice it to say that the priests know how it's done.
Oh, I guess we'll figure out how cognitive shadows get around this in the sequel. That's fantastic, because Warbreaker was like more than 10 years ago. He should be pretty close to finishing the sequel by now. Oh. Well, I guess he's had plenty of time to work on it. I mean, like, he's written 6 secret projects in that amount of time, so the Warbreaker sequel must be, like, really, really coming up on his plate, right?
So any idea when we're going to get the sequel to Warbreaker?
I have no exact promise. My goal right now is to get Stormlight 5 out, right?
Okay. So after Wind and Truth, that's great. As of the recording of this video, that book comes out at the end of the year, so we're pretty close.
And then alternate Mistborn, Elantris, Mistborn, Elantris, Mistborn. Warbreaker, we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. I do intend to get to it, but it's entirely possible that this won't be something I do until, like, after Stormlight 6.
Okay.
I've also been told via word of Brandon that the Heralds, under certain circumstances, can also have children.
Is it possible for heralds to have children?
So, yes.
Asterisk?
What's unclear to me is whether that asterisk attached to that yes also applies to heralds, or whether that means that the heralds could have had kids before they became cognitive shadows. If it's the case that the heralds in their current form could theoretically have children, that means that a certain popular theory about a character in the Stormlight Archive has stronger legs to stand on, let's say. But I'm not gonna go into that here. Let's just move on to the next rule. The next rule is...
2. Cognitive shadows cannot leave the planet they died on due to connection pulling them back to their anchor. This rule has very few exceptions. Invested beings and investiture tied to location have a difficult time leaving said location.
For example, Stormlight is very difficult to transport off Roshar because 1, gemstones are an imperfect vessel, they leak, and 2, they get tugged back to Roshar because that investiture is tied to that location. This same tugging can be seen by Kelsier in Secret History.
As he got farther from the shore, he felt a tugging at his soul, a manifestation of his ties to the world he'd left behind. He knew, without having to experiment, that this tug would ultimately grow strong enough that he wouldn't be able to continue forward.
In this example, Kelsier doesn't have a physical body, but seemingly having one isn't enough to overcome this weakness. However, there are apparently ways around this limitation. To my knowledge, the only cognitive shadow we've seen actually leave their planet, whether that's in a physical body or not, is Vasher. It's unclear how he does this, but we do know that it's possible. Furthermore, we do know that it's possible for other cognitive entities like Spren to leave their home planet, but the mechanics, how this is done, are still unknown.
Has Kelsier done any world hopping?
Kelsier is bound to Scadrial in the same way that a Spren is bound down to Roshar. Because of the level of investiture and the type and the way it happens, it is possible to get off-world.
3. Cognitive shadows that are anchored to something in the physical realm instead of the cognitive realm retain less of their identity. The two examples we have of cognitive shadows anchored to something in the physical realm instead of the cognitive are nightmares and shades. Both of these cognitive shadows seem to lack some of their identity and memories. Nightmares are anchored to the father machine in the physical realm and appear to retain even less of their connection than most other types of cognitive shadows. This could be one of the reasons that they're so easily influenced by the perceptions of others.
Shades are a weird enough example, I will talk about them later.
4. They are influenced by the perceptions of others over time. I'll talk about this a bit more in another section. 5. It takes direct Shardic intervention to put a cognitive shadow into a physical body. This is true for every example we've seen in the Cosmere thus far except for one. Whether it's a shard deliberately stapling a shadow into a body or a shard directly creating the mechanism by which a cognitive shadow can be resurrected.
The exception to this rule is Kelsier. His refleshifying... Rust, you're telling me Ghosts is real now? Anyway, it seems to have to do with hemalurgy.
Now here's a list of cognitive shadows by planet and their anchors. Roshar. The Heralds are anchored to the Oath Pact. The Fused are anchored to Odium and the Everstorm. The Stormfather is a cognitive shadow of Tanavast, anchored to the Spren of Storms. There's an argument to be made that Szeth is a cognitive shadow. When Zyle was explaining the process of a soul being stapled into a physical body, he mentions that Szeth underwent a similar process. His soul was restored by a supercharged fabrial of regrowth. It's not 100% certain if this counts as him being a cognitive shadow placed in a restored body like it returned, but I think it's still a good idea to include on this list. His body was restored shortly before he would have passed into the Beyond, so I'm not sure on this one. Do you think Szeth is a cognitive shadow? Sound off with your opinions in the comments section down below. Scadrial. Kelsier was anchored to the Well of Ascension and then Preservation directly. Nalthis. The Returned are anchored to their divine breath when shoved into their restored body. Threnody. Shades are weird, I will talk about them later.
Okay, I feel like I talk about shades all the time. They're weird, they don't make sense, and they just seem like the exception to everything. They're frankly terrifying. And like the only way that I'm ever gonna learn more is by observing them. That's how science works. So I'm just gonna have to go there someday. I really don't want to, okay? I am putting it off at this point.
Komashi. Yoki Hijo are anchored to Splinters of Virtuosity. Nightmares are anchored to the Father Machine.
For a cognitive shadow to get a new physical body, Shardic intervention is usually required. In the case of the Heralds, it's not entirely sure what mechanic is happening there. I imagine these mechanics are part of the Oath Pact to facilitate the endless cycle of desolations and rebirths.
For the Fused, it's a little different. A new body isn't made for them, but they're able to possess the bodies and remove the soul of living singers, hijacking their bodies. Perhaps hijack isn't quite the right term. Living singers need to open themselves to the bond, implying some form of consent, although there is significant societal and hierarchical pressures pushing singers to volunteer. This could be facilitated by singers having gem hearts allowing cognitive entities easier access to their physical forms, as well as deliberately opening themselves to the soul of the Fused. Once possessed, the Fused is able to change the physical appearance of the body, altering things like skin pattern and carapace patterns. Returned are chosen specifically by the Shard Endowment. When a person dies and is selected to become returned, they are given a vision of the spiritual realm and offered a choice. If they choose to return, their bodies are healed and Endowment staples them back into their original body, but removes access to their memories.
Side note, and major spoilers for the Hero of Ages here, but I'm like 80% certain that Sazed could have turned Vin and Elend into Returned if he wanted to. He had rebuilt them, their physical bodies, and he was juiced up enough that he could have put them back in if they had chosen to return to life. Yoki Hijo are an odd case. They seem to persist as cognitive shadows through sheer force of will because they are just so highly invested. We're talking like Elantrian levels of invested here. Yoki Hijo are also able to transform spirits into useful physical tools. Basically, they're able to manifest a spirit into the physical realm.
Yumi, we decide what is right. Nightmares can be real, why not dreams? You have power granted by the spirits. Your whole life, your dozens of lives. You've used it to serve. Use it for yourself, this once.
The exact mechanics of how Yumi was able to get a new physical body aren't super clear. I think it has something to do with Painter's nightmare painting and also the Yokihijo's ability to manifest and bind spirits into the physical realm.
Cognitive shadows do have some serious limitations and weaknesses. All cognitive shadows that persist for a significant amount of time need to find a way to manage their memories. Essentially, because they've existed for far longer than a mortal is supposed to, their minds run out of storage space.
This affliction isn't exclusive to cognitive shadows, though. It applies to anyone who's lived longer than they should have and has run out of brain space to store the memories. This limitation can be overcome by storing memories externally in sources of investiture like breaths or a copper mine. It's like my PC. My C drive is almost completely full even though I've been using external drives to store video. To keep my computer functioning, I'll either have to delete files or move them to external hard drives.
Another weakness that cognitive shadows have is that they are all susceptible to interference and destruction. Because their souls are fossilized copies made of investiture, cognitive shadows are susceptible to being destroyed by anti-investiture. If attacked by someone wielding the correct type of anti-investiture, their souls can be completely obliterated.
If the connection to an anchor is somehow severed, or the anchor physically destroyed, then the cognitive shadow ceases to exist. They get pulled into the beyond. We saw this in Yumi and the Nightmare Painter when the Father Machine got deactivated, and also confirmed by a herald in the end of Rhythm of War.
The bond is what keeps us alive. You sever that and we'll slowly decompose into ordinary souls, with no valid connection to the physical or spiritual realms. Capture one of us with your knives and you won't be left with a sprint in a jar, foolish ones. You'll be left with a being that eventually fades away into the beyond.
The fact that cognitive shadows can be influenced by the perceptions of others could be considered a weakness, because given enough time, they would fundamentally be changed, becoming more a force like a spren than a person like a cognitive shadow.
Okay, so spren are reflections of how people in the physical world realm see things. So if you have a cognitive shadow, would their personality change based on what people in the physical realm see?
So they would be... The short answer is not as much as you're worried about. No more than we tend to change based on what people say to us and how we interact with the people around us. The long answer is, over a long period of time, it can happen, right? And it's going to depend on a number of factors, but we're talking a matter of centuries, not years. The same sort of thing you see happening to vessels of shards can happen to cognitive shadows. So the long answer is yes, but it's not an immediate worry, right? It's not like people start thinking of you and it shifts you, because your perception of yourself is enough strong usually that it rebuffs these sorts of things. Being self-aware does that. And a lot of the influence to things to like spren and things like that happen during kind of formative, non-quite self-aware times, if that makes sense. So if you were to become a cognitive shadow right now, it wouldn't be a major concern, but in 1,000 years, you may look back and say, wow, I was shaped by public perception in ways that I wasn't expecting.
The last thing I'd like to touch on are shades. Shades might be like the weirdest thing in the Cosmere. Even off-world, there's a threat that Threnodites can become shades. This might have something to do with the damage that was done on the spiritual realm when Ambition died, preventing Threnodites from being pulled into the spiritual realm. That's just a theory, though.
They seemingly don't need an anchor to any realm to prevent them from moving on to the beyond. All Threnodites have the potential to become a shade, the practice used to be codified, and they can leave their planetary system without any issues at all, as evidenced by the Irie having troops on the Threnodite border in the cognitive realm to prevent them from leaving.
The description that Nomad gives in The Sunlit Man about Threnodites having an echo attached to their soul could be that chunk of investiture that turns into a shade when Threnodites die.
That and the large amount of investiture that is tied to their souls. Threnodites, they have this phantom echo to their souls, a sort of smoky shadow that lives on after they die.
This ready-made but dark copy could persist in place of the original soul, albeit without a lot of the identity and memories attached to it. Yet another reason I don't ever want to go to Threnody. Anyway, I hope that was helpful in understanding one of the Cosmere's most unique and weird features. What do you think about cognitive shadows? Do you think they're interesting and fit thematically, or do they cheapen the overall severity of death in the Cosmere? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments section down below. And if you enjoyed this video and are liking Cosmere content, please subscribe. I will see you guys next time when I make some delicious chowta. Alright, see ya.